Um, Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Ali Julie. I work for California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Region 6, out of Ontario office. Today's lecture is part of the Conservation Lecture Series. An internet site for the lecture series now available. You can see it on your screen. You can view the schedule of upcoming lectures, register to attend lectures, and watch the videos of past lectures online. You're looking for the, okay, yeah. And here is the schedule of upcoming lectures. We have a lecture on Amargosa Bowl on June 9th, 1 to 3, and White Abalone, July 22nd, again, same time, 1 to 3 o'clock. Today we are pleased to have Becky Jones presenting a lecture on desert tortoise. Becky Jones graduated from San Jose State University with degrees in wildlife zoology and entomology. She started working for the Department of Food and Agriculture for 13 years before transferring to Department of Fish and Wildlife, and she's worked for CDFW since 1992. During her time with California Department of Fish and Wildlife, she's worked in the Mojave Desert and worked with species such as Mojave ground squirrel, desert tortoise, and worked on regulatory side of things in HAPCON, such as CEQA review, incidental take permit, uplisted species, and 1600 streambed alteration, lake and streambed alteration program. And I hand it to Becky Jones now for this very exciting presentation.
Thank you, Ali. First of all, I want to say, for anyone who doesn't know, tomorrow is World Turtle Day, so this just happens to be a pretty good time for the presentation. Anyway, as most of you probably know, the desert tortoise is our state reptile, and the department has had a long history of protecting the species. There's been state laws since 1939 prohibiting the purchase or sale of the tortoise. Since 1961, law has prohibited shooting or harming of the desert tortoise. In 72 and 73, Fish and Game codes were strengthened to prohibit the collection of wild tortoises. And then, of course, as everyone probably knows, it was listed as threatened in August of 1989 under the California Endangered Species Act. The desert tortoise used to include all the tortoise that were in California, Arizona, and going down to Mexico. In 2011, there was a publication in Zoo Keys by Murphy et al. That figured out there were actually two different species within those. What was known as the Sonoran tortoise is now the Morocco, and ours is called the Agassiz land tortoise. Often easier to refer to them as the Mojave tortoise and the Sonoran tortoise. Besides the genetics showing the difference, there are other differences. These are just a few of them. One is the range of each of the species. The Mojave tortoise is north and west of the Colorado River. The Morocco is south and east of the Colorado River. The body shape is different between the two. Ours is more dome-shaped. The Morocco is more pear-shaped, and it's more flattened. The reason it looks more flattened is it's predominantly in slopes and rocky hillsides and generally uses rock caves for burrows, whereas the Mojave tortoise is predominantly in valley and alluvial fans. But as we're seeing with global warming, they're starting to move up more into rocky areas. Another one of the differences, the number of clutches that they lay per year. Mojave is 0 to 3, depending upon rainfall, and the Morocco is none or 1 clutch. Here you can see the distribution. The black here is the Mojave population. This one is the Sonoran population. Some of the recent genetics is demonstrating, though, that there's actually two different species within this area. The one in Arizona and going down to a little bit into Mexico, and then the one further down. There should be a paper published soon describing the other species that's down there. Here you can see the critical habitat units that we have for the Mojave tortoise. And California makes up about 73% of the total critical habitat in the recovery plan. The 73% does not include a lot of Joshua Tree National Park or the Desert Tortoise Preserve area, which is up over here in Kern County. So it's probably actually a larger area than that. Basically, the desert tortoise reaches sexual maturity at 15 to 20 years. Over here you have a female tortoise. Some of the difference between the females and the males. A female has a short, what's called a gular horn. She has a flat plastron, a short tail, and they also have longer toenails or claws, and that's so that they can dig their burrows to lay the eggs in, digging within the burrow to lay the eggs. The male has the male has enlarged chin glands, a much larger gular. There's a concave in the plastron there, and they have a longer tail. As you can see in this picture below, the male gular horns are often used in battle against other tortoises during mating season. Now, tortoises spermate in the winter. One of the things that's really important to remember, especially if you're working on any permitting projects, is that tortoises can be active any time of the year depending upon temperature and rain. This year, tortoises were actually emerging in February, which is earlier than what's normally considered for them. I have seen them out basically when it was snowing if they were really looking for water. They can come out in colder temperatures. Now, females can store sperm. In at least one case in a captive tortoise, they've been known to store sperm for up to 15 years. And they'll lay 1 to 12 eggs and may lay several clutches in a year if there's enough water and vegetation for them to eat. The males happen to have the highest testosterone level of any vertebrate, and that peaks in the late summer. Now, this is your basic colored tortoise pretty much, but colors can range from blondish to almost black. And you can see the scutes, and those cover the bone of the tortoise. Most tortoises' home ranges are from 2 to 40-plus hectares. The females have generally smaller home ranges than the males do. This tortoise is, as you can see, is getting to look a little old. Older tortoises, their scutes tend to sink. They kind of get like an osteoporosis as they get older. And as the tortoise grows, extra layers of keratin are added underneath the existing layers, causing the rings that you can see in this picture. Mating can occur anytime from spring through late summer to early fall, but generally most of the ones that really take are in late summer and early fall when the male has the higher testosterone level. The female will lay her eggs, usually very often right near the mouth of the burrow that they're using, and the eggs usually hatch the following year in late summer, but some overwinter and hatch the following spring. Hatchlings are about the size of a silver dollar. They hatch in late summer. Their shells are very soft for the first 5 years, and that's why they often become prey to ravens. The hatchlings come out with a yolk sac, which has enough food to carry them until the next spring, when hopefully there's a good rainfall and there's plants. And they're often hard to find because especially for the first year, they might be using rodent burrows. So if you're on a project, you might be missing some of them because people aren't looking in rodent burrows for tortoises. Tortoises are selective in choice for foods. Food preference depends on locality and availability of food items. In general, tortoises feed on herbaceous, perennial, and annual wildflowers, such as wishbone bush, lotus, loco weed, blazing star, lupins, Indian wheat, forget-me-nots, desert dandelions, gilias, phacilias, and many other species. They also eat annual and perennial grasses and fresh pads and buds from some cactus. They don't eat shrubs such as creosote bush or burro bush, which are very common in the desert. Some of you may have heard of pet plants. In the absence of late spring or summer rains that permit drinking, desert tortoises must obtain sufficient water and nitrogen in food plants to excrete ingested potassium, which builds up during their system during drier periods. They do this by selecting foods that have a high PEP value. The amount of protein, nitrogen available to support growth, reproduction, and disease resistance will depend on the PEP value of the overall diet. Threats. I'm not going to go into these in a lot of detail because there's so many of them, but predators have become a big problem recently. Ravens and coyotes are probably the worst. At the bottom here, you can see a shell that has been pecked by a raven. Eagles, badgers, desert tip fox, free-roaming dogs are also big. Eagles aren't a big problem, but badgers and desert tip fox and free-roaming dogs have been a large problem in recent years. In areas where they have what they call the Head Start program, where they bring females in from the wild, put them in pens, have them lay their eggs, and try and reduce some of the predation on the eggs and also the young, depending upon the experiment that's going on at the time, they've had problems with fire ants and ground squirrels attacking the eggs and the hatchling tortoises. Other threats are grazing, OHV use. There's my little guy. This is a picture that just came in a couple of days ago from a tortoise that was found on a project that had been run over. OHV use, besides running over tortoises, you can see how it can destroy the habitat that's out there. Once you get areas like this, you have more alien species coming in. Military activities, alternative energies. The reason I put these two together is because both can take up a lot of land, especially on military expansion projects. And as you can see, this is a picture of Ivanpah that went out off of the I-15. Besides the fact that they're impacting the habitat, they also deal with translocation on both cases. And this can be a problem for tortoises. I'll show that to you later. Mining past and present. Mining is a problem because they'll often leave pits out in the desert, which tortoises can fall in and get killed. They also have a habit of leaving toxicants, especially from the old mining projects, or we have had some problems with some of the newer ones, which are rare element mining and radioactive, and we've had some leaks on those projects, which have gone into the desert area. And of course, urban development takes up a lot of habitat. Plus, as it moves out into the desert, a lot of dogs end up getting loose and roaming free in the desert and chewing on tortoises. Other ones are exotic plant species, roads and railways, wildfires, global warming. At the Desert Tortoise Council Symposium this year, there was a talk on global warming. One of the presentators there said that basically if warming kept up the way it was, there might not be any tortoises left in the desert by 2040. Collection of tortoises is still going on in the desert. We don't always find that. People go out and pick them up. Some cultures for ceremonial reasons. Other people just wanting to take them home and have them. We're still finding tortoises that have been shot. Burrows can be a big problem, especially down in the Colorado desert. And then agricultural development. Here's pictured a healthy tortoise. You can see by the green on his beak area that he's been eating and found some nice green vegetation to eat. Mycoplasma. Many of you that have worked with tortoise or are familiar with them have heard of the upper respiratory disease. Mycoplasma is known to cause upper respiratory disease. It's a bacterial disease. It was first found in the captive population in the 1970s and was found at the Desert Tortoise Research Natural Area in the wild population in 1988. Until just recently, we had 2 species that we knew of. The one that we've known of since the 70s is the Mycoplasma agassizii, and one that we found about 10 to 15 years ago, the Mycoplasma testudinium. And in surveys of the desert tortoise, or the DTRNA, in 89 through 1990, it became clear that many of the tortoises were ill with this disease, and shells of many tortoises were found to indicate that there was a major die-off there. Symptoms include nasal discharge, puffy eyelids, eyes recessed into the orbit, dullness to the skin scutes, weight loss, and lethargic or erratic behavior. Sometimes when you do see a tortoise that's out near the mouth of its burrow at an appropriate time of year and it's just sitting there, it very well could be sick. During the Fort Irwin translocation, one of the tortoises that became severely ill was sent to be necropsied, and it came up with a new species of Mycoplasma, which was found on the penis. So that might kind of not necessarily mean it's just an upper respiratory disease. Generally, the Mycoplasma is transmitted when one tortoise comes into contact with an infected tortoise. Another disease that's been known for quite a while is cutaneous dyskeratosis, shell disease. We aren't sure of the origin of this one still. Initially, it was identified in the Chuckwalla Bench area, which is in the Colorado desert. It's typified by lesions on the scutes. Areas that are affected by shell disease appear discolored, dry, rough, and flaky, with peeling, pitting, and chipping through multiple cornified layers. In advanced cases, exposed areas become infected with bacteria, fungus, and exposed tissue and bone may become necrotic. We still don't know the means of transmission for this disease, but there are some hypotheses which include autoimmune disease, exposure to toxic chemicals, and deficiency disease, which might be caused because of exotic plants that are out there. Herpesvirus was first found in the captive population in 1982 and was seen in the wild in 2003. Just recently, 2 additional new species of herpesvirus were found in California. You see the lesions here in the mouth that's quite characteristic, the plaques of herpesvirus. That's often what you see. The role of herpesvirus is still not clear, but it may operate as an important pathogen in wild tortoise populations. Unlike Mycoplasma, herpes can persist in the environment for a long time. The frequency of tortoises with herpesvirus and positive ELISA tests has been increasing in recent years. This was a new one that was found in 2012, and this problem was described by Dr. Elliot Jacobson and others in a paper at the 2013 meeting of the Desert Tortoise Council Symposium, and is the subject of a journal article that will be out shortly. The tortoise was wild, and from a long-term study plot outside the fence at the DTRNA, the tortoise has a plaque or similar covering parts of both eyes. You can see in here. Toxicants. This is the list of the most common toxicants that were found in a 2012 study. They can often be found in different tissues within the tortoise, and elevated levels of toxicants have been implicated as a potential cause of disease in the desert tortoise. Element concentrations differ significantly by tissue type in tortoises ill with shell disease, infectious disease, metabolic disease, and mycoplasma. Arsenic appears to be one of the major players, but it is by no means the only important element. In one study, all ill tortoises showed elevated levels of arsenic. We've had some tortoises that came from near mining areas that were high in arsenic and also mercury, which was probably used for processing at the time. Stressors are also another important factor. Droughts, both annually and seasonally. Food quality and availability. Remember talking about the pep plants earlier. There's so many alien plants out in some areas that they're out competing some of the native plants that would be out there. And there's also depletion of the seed banks through grazing. Toxicants, as we mentioned, are also a stressor. And injuries from predators can stress the tortoise. We're working on figuring out exactly how they affect the tortoise. A tortoise with one disease might not show any clinical signs. A tortoise with a disease and a stressor are more likely to show signs and more likely to be ill and die. A tortoise with two diseases is more likely to die. You can see in this one where the tortoise has a bit of a runny nose there, which is probably an indication that he has mycoplasma. There's no simple answers. Clinical signs are not always evident or overlapping. Diseases may be latent, once acquired, always present. Multiple tests may be necessary for pathogens and parasites. And for a lot of the new ones that are coming up, we don't even have tests for those at this point in time. This is one area that does need a lot of research. We'd like to learn what the effects of two pathogens operating together are. Herpesvirus still needs a lot of studies. Transmission is a big one. We aren't sure how that's transmitted, exactly where in the tissues it's going to be found. We don't know whether tortoises are able to mount an immune response. And we need to study the new mycoplasmas and find out what's going on with those. And we might even be coming up with more, we don't know. with elevated toxicants. We'd like to establish baseline for adult tortoises at multiple sites, multiple seasons, and determine whether toxicants can be transferred to the eggs. Nutrition also, since it plays a big part in the tortoise's growth, we need to do research on areas here, how it affects the egg production of the females, the thickness of the shells, and resistance to disease of the animals. Population trends. There are currently there's basically two different methods that we've been using for long-term, or for studying the population trends within the desert tortoise. One is the long-term study plots. The other is line distance sampling, which is basically range-wide monitoring. I'm going to go over a little of a presentation, and then I'll show you some slides after of what the population trends are doing. But in the 1970s and in 1980, 27 desert tortoise study plots were established in the California desert by Dr. Christine Berry. 15 of these became part of a long-term program for the tortoise. All 15 study plots are either in or adjacent to critical habitat. These plots have been invaluable because they give us 30-plus years of data sets to analyze demographic attributes of tortoises, health and disease in tortoises, changes in vegetation, and anthropogenic impacts. The department has helped to fund some of these study plot surveys. Unfortunately, we are definitely a bit behind on them. Some of the things that we have found. The first large population decline was found in the West Mojave between the 70s and the mid-90s, with up to 90% decrease in some populations. Higher than normal losses or mortality rates were attributed to many causes, which we have mentioned previously. By 1990, stable and or increasing population trends on study plots were limited to sites in the eastern Mojave and the northern Colorado desert. A plot in Ward Valley was surveyed in 91 and 95, between which time the population had declined 41%. Many of the dead tortoises and live tortoises had shell lesions. In Upper Ward Valley, which was surveyed last in 2002, 17 live tortoises and 109 shells were found. This amounted to about an 80% decline since 1995. In the Chuckwalla Bench area, which was mentioned earlier, in the Colorado desert, it began to see declines in the early 80s, and declines were correlated with shell disease. By 1992, the bench population had declined about 70%, and further declines were recorded in 1996. In 1999, Chimwavy Valley plot was resurveyed. It had previously been surveyed in 88 and 92, where the number of tortoises were 257 and 235 respectively. During a spring survey in during the spring survey in 1999, 38 live tortoises were found and 327 dead. Over 55% of those had appeared to die in the last 4 years, and most, if not all, had died since the plot was last surveyed. The decline between 92 and 99 was 84%. The Goff population was surveyed in 2000 after not being visited since 1994. Between 1980 and 1994, 220 to 296 tortoises were registered on the plot. In each of the 3 sample years. In the spring of 2000, only 30 live tortoises were found and about 393 remains of dead tortoises. That was about a 90% die-off since it had been surveyed the previous time. Shadow Valley, another plot which is in the East Mojave, was surveyed in 2002. The previous survey was in 1992, and in 92 there were about 50 tortoises found. In 2002, 7 live and parts of about 30 shells were found. It is a decline of about 80 to 85% in 10 years. This population might not even be viable any longer. Ivanpah, which is also in the East Mojave, was also surveyed in 2002 after not being sampled since 1994. The decline there was approximately 50% during that time. That's a little bit about study plots. I'm going to give you a brief description of the line distance sampling and range-wide monitoring. This is headed up by Linda Allison with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Desert Tortoise Recovery Office. And it started in 2001, where they go through the desert doing transects. That year they did about 3,018 kilometers. And the technique changed in 2004 to 2005. So when we come up to those slides, that's the distance that, the time frame that we're going to be looking at those from. This is one of the plots I didn't mention. You can see the decline in the Fremont Valley of all sizes of tortoises. Fremont Peak. So it wasn't a large population to begin with. Last time in 2007, they couldn't find a single tortoise out there. Lucerne Valley, which is in the West Mojave. These past 3 have been in the West Mojave. It didn't show as much of a decline as some of the others, but there's still certainly a steady decline there. And in 2005, when they were out there, one of the big problems that they saw were free-roaming dogs. They actually found one attacking one of their tortoises. They found the owner. And what happens is a lot of people just let these dogs run loose out there. The dogs go home and feed at night, and they stay at their home, but during the day they're out running in the desert. So that's been a big problem, especially in the West Mojave area. Kramer Hills, another large decline, which is in the West Mojave. This is one from the Desert Tortoise Research and Natural Area. As mentioned, with the diseases, we saw the big decline going into the early 80s and kind of continued. And actually, this is almost one of the positive aspects here. It appears to have come up just a little, which is the only area we know that it's done that so far. These are from the Fish and Wildlife Service. They're doing a manuscript with these, and hopefully it's under peer review right now, so it should be out for publication soon. The Upper Virgin River is in Utah. Their population's been declining. West Mojave, going down. Colorado Desert, pretty much going down. There are some aspects there that look like they're doing almost stable. East Mojave, on the decline. Now the Northeast Mojave, this one is in Nevada. And all these next couple of slides are the ones that are under review for publication. Changes in abundance. If you look at this, the West Mojave is really having a bad time. From 2004 to 2012, basically they lost half the population out there. Colorado Desert in decline, East Mojave in decline. You know, these are the California ones right here. They also looked at the relative abundance of smaller tortoises, and that they've seen over time. When they do the line distance sampling, they only basically are looking for adults that are above ground. It's the method that's used. The only one, there again, Colorado Desert. The East Mojave looks and that's the one that's in Nevada. Looks like it's doing okay. And our West Mojave is going down. I had mentioned that we had a little bit of hope at the Desert Tortoise Research and Natural Area. This is an excerpt from a presentation by Dr. Christine Berry on how management can affect the status of the desert tortoise population. The objective here was to compare tortoise densities and attributes, identify factors affecting recovery, provide recommendations for recovery, and enhance vehicle management. There'll be three management areas that you'll see in here: the research area, critical habitat in Fremont-Kramer, and private lands that were recently acquired by the Preserve Committee. This is the critical habitat area. This area in here is the dt-RNA. Over here, and down here are the ones that they did the sampling from. These were hectare plots that were used throughout these areas. The dt-RNA has over 30 years of protecting. It's been fenced. They've eliminated the grazing. There's no mining in the area, and the off-road vehicle use has been curtailed. Private land, not protected from grazing, vehicles, or dumping. See the sheep there in the background. Fremont-Kramer critical habitat, a lot of intense sheep grazing going on, even though it's critical habitat. In fact, I was called this year because there were sheep grazing out there, and they weren't sure what we could do about it. I found out right near the end, and hopefully next year maybe we'll be able to do something about that. Theoretically, sheep grazing is supposed to be excluded. They can't do it on BLM land because of a BO that they have with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And there's also recreational use that's still going on a lot out there, and you often find mining area. This can show you what protection of areas can do. If you had noticed in the other slides, from the study plots that have been done out there, they all basically had the same decline. But then at the dt-RNA, it looks like the population is starting to come back a bit. And this, from these intervals, this shows a really good sign of what management can do to help increase population. So after about 40 years, it's looking good. Translocation is a big issue one of these days. The biggest translocation project that we had was out at Fort Irwin, where over 800 tortoises were translocated out there. All those tortoises basically came from what was called the Southern Expansion Area, which was already part of the Fort Irwin boundary, had been considered critical habitat because the populations were so good out there. This is from one of the research projects that went on. There were at least 3 different research projects that went on with the translocation that was out there. This one has 4 translocation sites that were used. They translocated approximately 40 tortoises into each of those sites. Those are each 1 square mile. The tortoises were translocated in March of 2008, and post-translocation, they've been doing monitoring monthly for survival and seasonally for health. We're going to be talking about survival at this time, and that didn't look too good. Study plot 8 wasn't too bad. Overall, approximately 28% or 44 of translocated tortoises in all are still alive. The number of individuals varied between release locations. Here we are looking at the percent alive on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. In March of 2008, we started with 100% live, and by 2013, we can see that there are significantly more translocated animals alive on plot 8 and also on plot 1.5. The black lines on the map are the percent alive for each plot, but it treats the individuals that are currently missing as dead. The gray lines, come back here, like this one, down here, and there's one here that's kind of hard to see. That counts the missing animals as alive, but there isn't that much difference, and the actual is probably a little bit somewhere in between. They occasionally find live animals that have been transmitted, but they haven't recently. They focused on the 96 individuals that died and basically assigned what caused the death. The majority appeared to be predation by canids and ravens. One of the things that was interesting at Fort Irwin that we found, it was the first time ever that we have records of ravens attacking and killing adult tortoises. We had known they'd done the hatchlings and the juveniles for quite a while, but we found them attacking and killing the adult tortoises, which is basically all they were working with here. A couple died of hypothermia. There were 2 that were crushed by vehicles. And I guess somebody's raised their hand. I'm gonna, if I can answer questions at the end, I'm gonna leave a long question and answer period if that's okay. One, it appeared to have been dropped by an eagle out there or something, and that was crushed. There were 2 just in this group that were salvaged for disease, and one that died of a snake bite. This is a graph of the overall death rate per year with percent death rate plotted on the y-axis and year on the x-axis. The various patterns that make up each bar represent the 4 release plots. If we start with the 2008, we can see the high death rate overall, close to 44%. In 2009, we continue to see a high death rate. It begins to drop off after that until the recent spike in 2013. Changes in death rates are associated with drought, prey base associated with droughts, and predators. Just from this project alone, we have come up with a lot of questions on translocation that really need to be addressed. We don't really have a long-term study to look back at where they've looked at the tortoises continuously to determine what the survival rate is. How is the long-term survival influenced by the release-related decisions, whether it's the location, the habitat, seasonal and annual droughts? What information can we apply to the future translocations to increase survival rates? Are translocated tortoises more susceptible to certain sources of mortality? I also have a thought in looking over some of the figures, because in Ivanpah, it's been a close ratio of tortoises that were translocated and the host population into which they were translocated into, is that our tortoises that are translocated, especially dominant males, kicking other tortoises out of their burrows so that they're more apt to be predated on. Do patterns of mortality change by site and overall time? Now I'm going to get into a few things that I've often had questions on that have come to me on projects and stuff. For large projects, basically over 1,000 acres, the service and BLM say you can do the probabilistic sampling. And the department wants to require 100% coverage. There are several good examples of this. One happens to be Ivanpah, where they started out with a probabilistic study. They said they were going to have 27 tortoises out there, and they came up with about 100 tortoises out there. So it kind of shut down the project for a bit while they ended up doing the BO. I had another project where they had gone out, done the probabilistic, and I said, no, go back, do 100% coverage survey on there. It was an 8,000-acre project. First time through, they found 9 tortoises. The other thing I looked at while I was there, when I was reviewing that project, is the biologists who were conducting the surveys. I went through maybe 47 biologists that were out there. None of them had tortoise experience, except for one, and he was doing botany. So I told them, get good biologists, sample the whole thing, and come back. Well, the next time through, they had 99 tortoises. Often you'll find tortoises in groups in areas that could be missed if they do the probabilistic sampling. And in order to do a good translocation plan for a project, you really need to know the number of tortoises that are out there, because it's a lot different from 9 tortoises to 99 that they find. And you figure you're probably lucky if you find about 50% of what's out there, since they spend so much of their 99% of the time underground. Another question that's come up: what percent slope can tortoises in habitat, and should these areas be surveyed? They can do greater than 100%, depending on the substrate and whether they have burrows or areas to go. They often make their trails going up and around to these areas. So if someone says, you know, we don't have surveyed that because it's too steep, say, nope, you sure do. We do not accept out-of-season surveys. There's been a rare case or two on a very small project that happened to be an old ag field that was less than 20 acres, where I did let them survey, provided it was a good biologist who knew how to find tortoise gaps. Other than that, we don't look at that. If a tortoise is moved less than 500 meters from the point of collection, do both a health assessment and disease sampling, be it blood samples or swabs, need to be done? The answer is yes, because we already know that tortoises might be ill but aren't showing any signs. So before anything is moved, we definitely want it. Another thing is if you have a female with a 2-hectare home range, that's out of the tortoise's home range, so it's going to be moved to a different area where it's not familiar with its surroundings. And tortoises don't move in a circle. You know, they might end up going more one way than the other, so they might not ever hit over to the area where you'd be moving them to. Is visual observation of a tortoise enough to determine that it has disease? No, it is not. People who conduct surveys, there's 2 types of surveys. There's the pre-project survey, and then there's the project survey itself. We like to have everybody submit a desert tortoise authorized biologist request form to us to review and approve. That doesn't always happen, especially on pre-project surveys, because we can't require that. But I do look through them on the projects I do, and if the people aren't qualified, I tell them to go back out and do the surveys again. I had one person who did ask me beforehand. They said, we have this biologist we'd like to use. Are they approved? And I said, well, I haven't heard of them before. So I said, give me their name, I'll call them and talk to them. So I called them and talked to them. And I said, are you going to be doing protocol surveys out there? And they said, oh, there's protocols? And I'm like, no, I don't think you're going to work for that. Called the project opponent back and said, find somebody else. I also often call the references to see if they think they're qualified. I think that's very important. What do I look for when reviewing survey forms? I want to know that a person can find tortoises if they're allowed to be out there for surveys, which is particularly important on clearance surveys. I had one thing where someone applied to be the lead biologist for a project. I went through, looked at his qualifications. He had over 1,000 hours in there, but had never seen a tortoise. I said, not only is he not going to be the lead biologist, he's going to have to work side by side with somebody until we know he can find tortoises. There again, I called a couple of people I knew working on the project, and they said, well, he probably didn't see anything. He was sitting in his car the whole time. Just because a person has been approved once doesn't mean they're going to be approved again. Everybody thinks that's pretty standard, but it's not. Proposed recipient sites should not be near roads or highways. That's been a big issue because in some of the projects the service really wants to see the area fenced and then tortoises move there. I don't think that there's an empty zone near the highway just because all the tortoises walk across the road. Generally, you have more toxicants coming off your vehicle, off vehicles that are using the roads. You've got more alien species out there, so the forage for them isn't as good. There's, numerous reasons why I don't think they should be near roads or highways. We do want a disposition plan for any time a tortoise is moved, even if the number of DTs desert tortoises are very low and it's a short distance. We want to know what they're going to do, where they're going to put it, and depending upon the situation, we'd probably also want it transmitted and monitored for a while to see if it does actually settle down. On Fort Irwin, some of the tortoises that they were monitoring, even after 5 years, were still moving around. And some just headed straight back to Fort Irwin, even though they were 5 miles away. Once a tortoise has been confirmed as sick, it should not be eligible for release. Because tortoises, once they have Mycoplasma, can very well stay in the system, and then if they get stressed, they can start showing symptoms, and then if they come in contact with another tortoise and they're shedding it, that tortoise can get sick too. We look at all our blood work to go and swabs to be sent to the University of Florida, Gainesville. They're the ones who have been doing the tortoise research for a long time. They have experts, the world's foremost mycoplasmosis person, Dr. Mary Brown, Dr. Elliot Jacobson, who's been doing all our complete necropsies and finding these new species that we've been looking at. Yeah, all proposed recipient sites need protocol-level surveys and density estimates, and we always include all tortoises that are out there. We're hoping that the small ones are going to make it to adults, so we know there is a big loss in the first 5 to 10 years. but we don't want any of the areas to become overpopulated. It's really hard to determine the carrying capacity of certain areas out there. You really need to find out what vegetation where you're going to be translocating, because some plants that are good for adults can't be eaten by the hatchlings and the juveniles. So you really need to look at all the plants out there. Going quicker than I thought. Will the tortoise survive? Protection of habitat is one of the biggest things that we need right now. I think in order for the tortoise to make it out in the desert. Removal of major predators is the second largest that we need out there. Those appear to be the two biggest things that are killing the tortoise. The populations, as you see, are extremely low these days in all areas, and that's shown by the long-term study plots and the range-wide monitoring. Tortoises are not doing well. I've often thought maybe they should be listed as endangered as the populations are decreasing so much. Research is going to help. Research on disease and toxicants are, I think, a big issue out there right now throughout the desert. But protection of habitat, I would have to say, is the number one issue that we have at this point in time, and protect it well. I'd like to offer a big thank you to Dr. Christine Berry with the USGS, who has done a lot of these studies, and to Linda Allison with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Desert Tortoise Recovery Office. And thank you guys. And I will now take questions. I think we have a chat.
Start with questions in the room, if
anybody here have any questions? Yes.
Talking about the habitat destruction, so I worked out a state line a lot. I saw a lot of tortoises there. And the mining there from
Molycorp.
I was there for a lot. Dad was in those areas. In other areas I worked in the desert. False populations of ravens and doves. They're very smart, you know. They're out of gunshot. Very split ravens are hard. So find the telephone poles and look underneath it, and there'd be the donate shells from the hatchlings. That for predator depredation?
The question is, have we been looking at trying to curb the depredation? Yes, there actually is a raven management group through the Desert Managers Group, and there's a raven management plan that's out. It allows for so many known offending ravens to be taken a year. Basically, there are people that go out, drive through areas, and especially along the power lines where a lot of ravens nest. And if they find an area where there's raven shells beneath the nest area, wildlife, or the U.S. Department of Wildlife Services is called, and they'll come out and they take care of them. But there is a certain amount of ravens that can be taken per year, according to the plan. I had asked them if we could get rollover ravens. You know, if you don't kill all that you have one year, can you roll that number over for the next year? But I guess we can't do that. But that's being worked on. Free-roaming dogs is a really hard issue. In Lucerne Valley, where we'd actually found the dog that was chewing on the tortoise, and they went back, they followed the dog back to its home, and basically the owner said, "Get out of here." It's really hard to deal with some of the homeowners on that.
You got game work, we have a law against it, or when
Yeah.
the dog's taken and the dog loose like that, we have no problem. We do it all the time with gun deer or, the tortoise, that's one of my pet peeves. I have no problem. Those guys out there working the desert are all for that too. Along the Coachella area, the old lieutenant out there, I used to go out with him and and those dogs got smart. The wild dogs, they see us within a mile or our vehicle slow down, they're off and running. Hard to shoot a running dog.
Yeah.
That's a major problem, and they get wise to us.
Yeah, those are a couple of the big problems. And coyotes, too. We had a lot of depredation. Yeah. Yeah. So, and actually, I think one of the other groups had found a couple of badgers predating on adult tortoises out there, but they're kind of protected with us, so that's kind of harder to deal with. We tried to do that on one of the projects, but it didn't work out too well. So, any other questions from the room in here?
Have you guys found out if any of those diseases will go into
the question is do we know if any of the diseases will go into the eggs? There has been once or twice it appears that might have happened. The tortoise that hatched was ill with the Mycoplasma, but it doesn't appear to be very common. But that's something that could use some more research. So. Oh, I had a question here. Let's see. I apologize, I'm not familiar with the protocol for surveys. Are the people doing the surveys physically touching the tortoises at all? If so, are there measures taken to keep from unknowingly spreading disease during the surveys? Okay, basically if it's just a pre-project survey, tortoises are not handled. If it's a clearance survey where they're moving tortoises off the site, then yes, gloves are required to handle tortoises at all times when out in the field. And how is rhodium harmful to the desert tortoise? It's very common, it's becoming more abundant out there, and it has very little nutrients for the tortoise that's in it. And it's often outcompeting the native vegetation. Do we have a question? And if that doesn't answer your question, let me know and I will. Or is there another question out there? I've seen someone raise a hand before. Oh.
Moving tortoises off highways?
Uh-huh.
For a long time, they said let them lay, but, kind of overstop. They stop right in the middle of the road on the same line. A lot of times, big trucks will go by, they'll see them. If I run them into the desert, hopefully the way that they're going. Put them under a bush with some shade, just in case. Quite a few get on the road. Now, the law states you can actually move them off the road. Has that changed? I haven't looked at it.
I don't think it's changed. But that's what we tell people. The thing was about moving tortoises off the roads, whether it's legal or not, if it looks like it's going to get killed. As far as I know, it's still not considered legal, but we do recommend if people do see a tortoise in the road, you pick it up both hands, lift it a short distance up, carry it in the direction it was heading, and then put it out under a bush on the other side of the road. If you take it back to the closest side, if that's where it was, it's just gonna go back across the road again. Once they make up their mind to go somewhere, they seem to have this thing, that's where they're going, and that's where they're gonna go, and they don't wanna change it. So, I had a call just this week from a person who said, we were driving back on I-40 and there was this tortoise there and I knew it was gonna get hit, and we picked it up and put it in our car and brought it back, what should we do? I said, oh boy. Luckily, it turned out they were going back to Nevada or Arizona to follow this week. I said, you know, keep it, you know, go on the California Turtle and Tortoise Club site. It'll tell you what to feed tortoises. Don't let it come in contact with any other tortoise. Go out there preferably early morning or later in the evening when it's cooler. If it happens to be a hot day, go walk out in the desert in the direction it was heading, put it under a bush, and I won't tell a warden. Do we have any other questions?
Becky, more of a warden question. What do you do with all the people that come into contact that have them in?
But,
I mean, it's just, I can't tell you how many, and I don't even live in the desert.
You're probably more in captivity than online.
I know, that I have a desert tortoise, or you see them in their backyard, and I just want to strangle them. It's so frustrating, but do they have to have tags, and can I say, could you please tag that thing before I turn you in?
There's a couple things on there that you deal with. Have the tag. I have probably given out 50 tortoises in the last. One tortoise when I was 5 years old, she was a male. That was the thing to have. We had a lot of tortoises. We had a seizure out there in the desert, and I wanted the hen, and you want the hen, and you got to take a few males. And every time I do a captive bred, I have to give them the permit, and then we put it under the shed. Tag wears out. Wears out. You'll see all those. All of them have the.
yes, URTD.
Yeah, and you know what? We have a thing there too. If they can prove they've had it for such a long time. A wild one get in someone's backyard and just go through. Desert, we had 30 of them. And we took and half of them died because they were like in the backyard and behind the fence. You'll see that. Go award and we go over there and go, hey, how you doing? A lot of disease, so we can't go out and I'm asking about the egg. Also, for them know, all mine have their phone number on the back of the album.
Form, and they can fill it out?
Well, let us talk to them first. We just heard herpers out there. I don't even want to call them herpers. That's how it
So
works.
I'm talking about people like, that have had them for years, and
If they've
Well-
had them for years, they go to the thing, and it's a matter of an address.
Theoretically, according to Fish and Game Code 5000, you can own a tortoise if it was legally acquired prior to 1972, which basically kind of excludes breeding.
No, it doesn't. That's how they get it, it's captive bred.
It
They
should.
They will hatch in my backyard farm.
So if it's captive bred, it's fine? They don't need a tag or anything?
Yeah, they did that.
Well, we're trying to discourage people from captive breeding because a lot of people don't know that, like this one girl who I talked to the other day, who they're going to go put the tortoise back where it was found. She said, should we go put it at the Desert Tortoise Natural Area? And I'm going, no. You've got genetics issues, you've got disease issues, you know, you don't want to put it out in the wild except right where it came from.
So the seeds are like parents of my kids, you know what I mean? So it's like, do I just give them the form and say, could you just please fill this out for me, because I can't handle seeing the tortoise in your front yard every time I see you? You know what I'm saying? It's like really frustrating.
Yeah, they've had them for a long time.
I don't know how long they've had it. I don't even want to ask.
They're all over the place. I can
okay.
the whole collectors.
That's where I am.
There's a bunch of collectors on 90 degrees now. They're driving down the road and go, wow, look at every tortoise. I'll go over and see if someone wrote their phone number stuff on it. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of reasons.
Okay, here's a question that we have here. It's, if we, CDFW staff, find a dead tortoise or remnants of one, should we collect it and send it to the lab, or should we just leave it and document it in the CNDDB? If there is a freshly dead tortoise, those would be the ones that we'd be interested in, because then we can find out about disease from the tissues. It would need to be refrigerated right away. We actually have a protocol for collecting or for getting salvaged animals, whether it's extremely ill or freshly dead. If it's not either of those, it should be left where it was found. Do we have any other questions from the phone audience here? I was expecting more questions.
Yeah, I encourage you over, go ahead.
So when you're picking the translocation sites, now that you've had some not so good success with the translocation, what are you doing now? Projects that have large number of tortoises and you need to translocate them, are you changing here?
The question is on picking translocation sites, knowing that some don't work, some sites don't work very well, which was demonstrated from the Fort Irwin study that was done. Are we changing our strategy? Finding a good translocation site is really difficult. A lot of people put them where we know there used to be tortoises and there aren't anymore. I think you'd want to find out why the tortoises aren't there anymore before you put them there. You know, it could be toxicants in the soil. It could be the vegetation's really poor. It could be there's a lot of predators in the area. So you really want to check out any translocation site that you're going to use to determine why they aren't there. If there's a lot of, if tortoises are there, maybe they're already at the carrying capacity that the area can handle. The numbers might be lower than they used to be, but because the vegetation changes type, maybe that's all that area can handle at this time. So putting additional tortoises in could threaten your population that's already there. One of the things that I know we did at Fort Irwin is that we required a good rainfall year when the tortoises were moved, so that we know there'd be adequate vegetation out there at the time. The problem is that was a good year that they were moved, but we did have high predation and high death rates that year. But the past couple of years had been a drought condition. So you didn't have the prey base of your rabbits, which the coyotes often feed on, or your smaller mammals. So they were going after the tortoises.
So it's complicated.
It's very complicated. You have to look at a lot of issues on any translocation project.
We already discussed it once with translation. The same problem, we can't relocate a bear because he might be a bad bear. Puppy bear that kicks everybody out. Well, I got that with one tortoise. But bigger other tortoise. They just battle all day with ladders. You guys have touched on that. You might have a real aggressive male that you translocate, he goes to
Yeah.
as you go in there. That's why I have this issue too. I've seen it on the desert, not to move them apart a little bit so you don't. Well, they don't chase each other around battle wall. Dominant one, look what's really everybody is.
Yeah, and I think that's a big problem with translocation is you don't know whether the tortoises you're moving in with the other tortoises are going to, and they probably are going to disrupt their social structure. So, and that's something I didn't even touch on with social structure of wild tortoises today. But it's quite complicated, really. Yeah, the question was, do we think we can, instead of buying land, use monies to do research? That's something I've always wanted to do. I managed to sneak it in for a little while with piggyback on when I had projects with desert tortoise and Mojave ground squirrels, since they're in the same area. And I was able to get them, instead of doubling the land compensation, to give so much to research for Mojave ground squirrel, which is where we needed some at that time. And then we'd pick up what's the land requirement, like especially if it was 5-to-1 compensation ratio that was in critical habitat. We'd do money for Mojave ground squirrel research, and then we pick up the land for desert tortoise stuff. But still make sure both species were on the parcels we were picking up. So I was able to do that there. That is something I would like to see, because how can we actually figure out the impacts from the project unless we can do some research on there? Well, some of these larger solar projects are doing research. Fort Irwin did research. Ivanpah is doing research of different types. Probably not the exact projects I'd really like to see. I think we need to look at more. One of the projects I had that was basically all on federal land, it wasn't impacting that much project, but they went in to help fund a head starting facility out at Mojave National Preserve. Plus they did some land compensation, but for the part that was on the Park Service land, that's what they did with that. And in the desert, a lot of our projects do cover federal land. And we'll still get some land compensation for some of that, but then if it's on BLM land, depending upon where the project is, if it's, they have a new name for it now, but basically desert tortoise critical habitat, their mitigation is a 5-to-1. And they will go through and some of their money, they can spend their money how they want. It doesn't have to be land compensation. With Ivanpah, that was in the BLM 1-to-1 area, but because some of us ahead of time knew it was really good habitat out there and there were a lot of tortoises, we've required 3-to-1 mitigation, even though it was BLM land. So 2-to-1 came to the department, land was bought with that, and the 1-to-1 went to BLM. There were discussions on how BLM was going to spend the money. Some of it was fencing roads. Some of it might be habitat restoration and closing the dirt roads that really serve no purpose out there, or, and restoring that. A couple of the projects, one of the things that I've wanted to see for one of the areas is cattle grazing is still a big issue in habitat. And do we allow closing of grazing allotments? That's something that's still being discussed for the larger projects. And to me, it makes a difference on where the cattle allotment is. The number of tortoises that are out there, there's one allotment, like Fort Irwin bought out 3 different cattle grazing allotments as part of their mitigation for their expansion. And those were all in critical habitat. There's another project that's out near Ivanpah that wants to buy out a grazing allotment. It's not in critical habitat. Most of the area already has one big solar facility, and there's another one going in. There might be the Desert Express that basically cuts it in half, which is, so most of it's already used, and it's not in critical habitat. I don't think that's a wise choice. Fjord Rodman grazing allotment is one we'd really like to see bought out. Bighorn sheep issues there, desert tortoise critical habitat. It would be a great one to buy out. So, you know, I think it really, depending upon the impact from the project and what they're looking at, there are other things that are going to help the tortoise, but I still think buying land and preserving it is a big one. Because I had one solar project that wanted to go into critical habitat. It was like a square mile, and they even found one of the translocated tortoises from Fort Irwin on there, and another one that was really close. You know, instead of having to move the tortoise twice, I said, put the land up for mitigation. There's a lot of people looking for mitigation land. You know, so it just kind of have to look at what's going on out there.
So it sounds like the BLM may.
The BLM has more flexibility, yes.
They have probably one of the few
away, or are they still? The big one where I made them go back to do the surveys, and they found a lot of tortoises. They went away. I don't know if they're going to come back again. One of the things I did do, most of the tortoises were up in the northern portion of the site. The bottom part was right near I-40, very sandy. They found one tortoise there. The other side of the railroad tracks wasn't bad. There were scattered tortoises, but this one area was really, when I figured it out, it turned out to be like close to 40 tortoises per square mile was the density, which is really high. So I told them if they went into that area, mitigation would be 5-to-1. If they went into this middle area, it'd be 3-to-1. And if they went into the bottom area, they could go with the BLM 1-to-1. Of course, they had to do 3-to-1 mitigation for Mojave fringe-toed lizard down there, but yeah. So that was Calico K Road, and they've since kind of disappeared. But who knows if somebody else will come back? I'm hoping if they do, the BLM will just say you can't go into the area up there. The question is, are we still having issues with burrows out there? Out in the Chimwavy area, there's a big issue with burrows out there. There are still some out around Ivanpah area. Yeah. I know that the preserve. Yeah, BLM at one point in time in the federal agencies, for anything that was in desert tortoise critical habitat, had done a large roundup in the different areas. Unfortunately, the Ivanpah Valley it was originally proposed for the first recovery plan to be incorporated into critical habitat, but it never was. So. Any other questions from anybody on the phone? Nope. Any other questions here? Okay, well, we got done early, folks. Thank you, everybody who called in. I wish we could have had more of a one-to-one discussion there. But if you ever have any questions, you can reach me at rebecca.jones@wildlife.ca.gov. And I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.